I've been teaching my students about the simple view of reading. And I would love for you to mention why is that so important to learn for teacher candidates?
It is very simple, but it's widely referenced in the scientific literature. And there's always people putting out papers saying, well, it's a little too simple and we should add X or we should add Y or we should add Z. But basically, I think even just the original simple view, it helps you understand a lot of things about reading development and reading problems. So just to kind of recap, the simple view says that there's two broad abilities that are important in reading comprehension. One is reading the words, which would include skills like decoding. Decoding is a really important driver of growth in reading. Like you cannot become a proficient reader of English or any other alphabetic language by memorizing all the words. It just wouldn't, that would be like saying we're going to have kids memorize all the numbers and they don't have to understand place value. Like, no, that's not going to work, right? So kids have to understand how to use letters to sound out words. That's basically what decoding is. And they have to learn, letter sound relationships. They have to be able to blend the sound. So once they've sounded out, s, at, they have to be able to put it together to make the word sat. They have to be automatic. Eventually, they have to be automatic in reading the word, not only accurate. So all of that goes into the word reading bucket. And then the other bucket or the other broad ability is oral language comprehension. And that includes things like vocabulary, background knowledge, just listening comprehension, listening to a story and being able to comprehend it, syntax or understanding like complex sentence structures. So one way you can think about reading problems is to be a good reader, you have to be good in both areas. And it therefore follows that students who struggle in reading can have a weakness in word reading or a weakness in language comprehension or a weakness in both areas. So that kind of helps you understand different poor reader profiles. And the profiles are descriptive. So there could be a lot of different causes that underlie a particular profile, but the profiles are a useful starting point for learning about reading problems and picking assessments and things like that. Another thing that I think the simple view helps you with is thinking about reading development. So early in development, for typical students, not students who are struggling, but for typical readers, a lot of growth in reading is about the word reading part, developing, letter sound knowledge and decoding and then automaticity. And language comprehension is always important, but in the early grades, it's not as important because the books we're having kids read are usually simpler types of books. And so growth in reading is more about mastering word reading skills. But then there's a shift around fourth grade or so where if you're looking at typical kids, most typical kids by around fourth grade have mastered the lion's share of the decoding skills they need to be good readers. And then further growth in reading becomes more about building vocabulary, building background knowledge, those broad language kinds of things. And so if you understand that, it helps you understand why is it, for instance, that some school reform programs have done a great job teaching phonics in the early grades, and it looks like the kids are doing great. And then all of a sudden they start to fall behind in the middle grades. It's often because the program didn't address broad language skills, and now the kids are expected to be able to, read books that tap that. And the solution is not to say, oh, we're not going to teach phonics. The solution is you have to do both. You need a comprehensive program that addresses both. So the simple view is just extremely useful for understanding all kinds of things in reading. You know, the decodables are most relevant if you have kids at the very beginning stages of decoding. As they advance in decoding, they usually learn enough word patterns so that you can use more, less controlled text once they know a lot of the one syllable word patterns. But at the beginning levels, they're very useful. And I guess a big point for the students is that you use those books in conjunction with oral activities like teacher read alouds of books at the students' like age level or their listening level.
But as you were talking, I was thinking about language learners, students who, especially those who come to the country as adolescents. How could we think in terms of the simple view of reading in helping language learners that are older and who don't have schooling experience in the US and are learning the language? How could we help teachers in addressing those two areas of word comprehension and language knowledge to help the students understand text?
So most English learners, if they have reading difficulties, the difficulties will typically involve either just language comprehension or a broader profile of mixed, both word reading and comprehension. Would be unusual in that population to find a student who only struggles with decoding, but not with the language comprehension. And again, I'm talking about English reading, could be different in their native language. It's really important to look at what's the nature of the student's native language. So if the student learned an alphabetic language like Spanish or Italian or German or something like that, and if it's an older student who had good literacy skills in their native language, there's often a lot they can transfer to English. Like they might have to learn specific English letter sound correspondences. Like in English, the vowels are really different than Spanish, right? And it's English is a more opaque language, meaning it's not as easy, it's not as one-to-one correspondence. Like in Spanish, an A is pretty much always an A, but in English, an A could be A like in cat, A like in cake, A like in salt, A like in a go, and a couple other things too. So it's much more complicated, but it's still the same principle. It's still the same idea. If the student grasps in their native language, oh, letters and letter patterns represent sounds, and it's a code, and I have to look carefully and sound out letters. And it's, left to right on a page, and that a lot can be transferred. Even things like if you have good, vocabulary and concept development in your native language, well, then you probably have those ideas in here. And it's more finding the what's the English label, right, for those things. So the native language, if the student had instruction in their native language and they didn't have a reading problem in their native language, then they can often transfer. They still need instruction for sure. Instruction, I think, can help them learn more efficiently and kind of catch up more quickly so that then they can kind of keep pace with the regular curriculum and not fall behind. But, it is an advantage to have had literacy in your native language.
Absolutely. So it almost goes like once a reader, always a reader,
Mm-hmm.
even if the languages are different, because, in your brain, so to speak, you already have cracked the code of one
Right.
language. So you already have
Right.
all the skills that it requires. In class, we have been talking a lot about deaf students' literacy. So I've heard from one of my students in the class that deaf schools are also experiencing an increase of deaf language learners who are immigrants to the country. Most of students who are born deaf, they are born deaf to hearing families.
Right.
So they don't really have a lot of exposure to sign language until they're older, perhaps because the family
Right.
doesn't know the child is deaf until much later, or perhaps because the family doesn't know how to sign, and it's difficult to learn another language.
Right.
For those students, the challenge is going to be even bigger, not only because they're learning English and they're learning to read English, but also because they probably don't have the native language, which for them would be sign language. They don't have that.
Exactly.
Plus the fact that English, as it is written, is really a second language for deaf learners who know how to sign. So, for all teachers, I think it's important to know that difference between language learners who have a language versus language learners who are learning a language later in life, like it's the case
Right.
for deaf learners.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So I'm saying all of that because you're making me think about situations. As we very well know, multilingual learners must acquire literacy skills and oracy in English at the same time that they learn content in school. So if we think about this, no opportunity can be wasted to support their oracy and literacy. How do you think teachers can embed literacy instruction in the content areas for our language learners?
I think one important thing to do is look at, the vocabulary of look at the texts that are being used. I'm assuming that the multilingual learner has some ability to read text, so we're not talking about a student where word reading is really low. In that case, I would probably work on that first. Try to build the students' word reading skills first. But many multilingual learners do have word reading skills in English, and it's more the comprehension piece that needs work. So in content areas, teachers want to take, vocabulary and directly teach important content vocabulary from the curriculum materials that students are reading. You can have them practice, instead of practicing, again, assuming the student can actually read words at grade level, have them practice things like determining the gist or understanding difficult syntax from using curriculum materials. Like, for example, one structure that can be hard, I don't know if this is particularly hard for a multilingual language learner, but one example for kids in general who have difficulties with syntax is when you have a center embedded clause. So let's say it's a sentence like, the scout who traveled in advance of the enemy troops approached the border at dawn. The scout who traveled in advance of the enemy troops approached the border at dawn. Well, it's kind of a confusing sentence because you have this embedded clause, who traveled in advance of the enemy troops. And some students will think it's the troops that approach the border at dawn, but it's really not, it's the scout. So the teacher can do things like whiteboard activities, bracket off the center embedded clause. And you don't necessarily have to teach formal grammar. You can just point out, this is a hunk of sentence that describes the scout. And the verb that goes with scout is approached. It's the scout who approached the border at dawn, not the troops that approached the border at dawn. And similarly, you could do whiteboard practice of kids. Another type of construction that's hard for older kids especially is like literary syntax or poetic syntax. Like in a lot of poetry, the words are kind of scrambled around, not the way that you would say them in everyday speech. So the teacher can take, phrases from poetry and kind of show how they would be reworded. But if the student is capable of reading the words of curriculum materials, I would use those and then embed skills like, vocabulary, syntax, finding the gist of a passage, which you could teach kids to do by looking at text structure, like look at the headings. If the heading of a history chapter is turning point, the Battle of Gettysburg. What's that section going to be about? Well, it's probably going to be about how the Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point in the Civil War, right? So you could teach kids those kinds of cues, but do it in the context of curriculum materials rather than, a workbook that doesn't have anything to do with what the kids are learning in school.
As you have stated in your books, reading instruction often occurs in a non-structured way, thus leaving students with voids in their capacity to read, for example, words based on decoding rules. But it can be difficult for teachers, especially those who aren't trained to be reading specialists, to put together a structured literacy program on their own. So what are some good resources that you could recommend to teachers so that they can teach reading more effectively?
So the number one resource I would recommend are the Institute for Education Sciences practice guides. And so it's IES practice guides, and you can find them just by Googling IES practice guides. And there is one for English learners. But also the ones that are for, there's one that's for like teaching early reading. There's a great one that just came out a couple years ago for reading interventions in grades 4 to 9. And a very important thing to keep in mind, even though only a couple of the practice guides I think are specifically aimed at English learners, the research shows that English learners who are struggling tend to benefit from the same types of interventions that monolingual English kids do. So, just like monolingual English kids do benefit from, phonemic awareness instruction integrated with explicit phonics instruction, if you have a multilingual learner who's struggling with decoding, they will probably benefit from the same type of instruction, but you need to also include some other things like building English vocabulary, for example, or, exploiting cognates. I forgot to mention that earlier, but, that would be something in content teaching. And the thing is, you don't have to speak 18 different languages. Like it's a wonderful resource if a teacher speaks more than one language, but you can look up on Wikipedia or look up in books what are different, cognate words in different languages, what are the features of different languages, and that can be a good starting point. So the IES practice guides are hugely helpful. They're written specifically for practitioners. They have consensus research recommendations, and then they have sections that tell you how to carry out the recommendation if you're a teacher, and they have sections on troubleshooting problems. Like somebody says, well, this doesn't work, or I can't, I have a student that's not benefiting. So they're really good. So that would be my first recommendation because it's free, and it's available on the web, and you can access it easily. There's also some great books. There's more and more researchers that have been writing books, and I appreciate you're showing my books. Thank you very much. But also here's a few others. I knew you were going to ask me this question, so I got a few. Elsa Cardenas Hagen, her book Literacy Foundations for English Learners. That's a good one. It's definitely a structured literacy approach. The other books I have are not aimed specifically at English learners, but I think that there's a lot that's transferable. Nancy Hennessy's book, The Reading Comprehension Blueprint, it's very focused only on comprehension, but it's extremely comprehensive. It does, vocabulary, sentence structure, text structure, background knowledge, and very practical. Everything that I'm showing is like very practical for teachers. Another really good one is Kelly Cartwright's book, Executive Skills and Reading Comprehension. And teachers might hear a lot about executive function, but there's a lot in reading comprehension that used to be called reading comprehension strategies, and we would now call it executive function. So those things like that I just mentioned as an example, like paying attention to headings and subheadings in a text, in an informational text, that's basically an executive function strategy, like having strategies to help yourself pick out the important ideas. Or if you have a paragraph at the end of a long section of text that starts, so to sum up, or in summary, right? That tells you, pay attention to that part. So sensitizing kids to that, having them generate questions about what they read. So there's a lot about that in this book. Again, not aimed specifically at English learners, but I think a lot of it is, transferable, very transferable. And finally, the core teaching reading source book, which you mentioned, I've used that. I love that book. Another good resource is Direct Instruction Reading. This one is a little more like nitty gritty structured literacy, but I think it's also very useful in its way. Some of the parts on comprehension, some people might find a little too mechanical. But I think it's still a really good resource, and it's very step-by-step. So I think when you're a novice teacher, that's a very helpful thing.
Well, Louise, thank you so very much for all the insight. And
De nada, amiga.
Ay, muchas gracias. I learned a lot, and I think this is going to be really helpful for my students and for their preparation. So I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Anytime. Thank you so much.